Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar regarding planting resiliency, exploring below-ground mitigation techniques for urban trees. You will notice a QR code on your screen. If you could screenshot that with your phone and log on to it, you'll be able to access our survey. For those of you who haven't been able to before we flip screens, just want to let you know that it will be presented again at the end of this presentation, as well as in your Zoom link. So with that, let me begin the presentation. So with me today is Dr. Andrew Kaufman, as well as Miles Ritchie. Both have been instrumental in this study. It has been a multi-year study that was started pre-COVID, delayed because of COVID. But what I want to say is the outcomes of this story, this study is very, very timely. As with some of the recent water series that we've had, as well as all the press regarding the evolution of the workplace environment and the restructuring of the urban landscape, this presentation will really be an invaluable resource, as well as provide us with actionable insights as to how we look at this environment in the future. So without further words, let me turn it over to Dr. Andrew Kaufman.
Aloha, good morning. As we say here, happy Aloha Friday. So let me get this fired up here. So today, Miles and I are going to be presenting our research, mitigating conflicts in the concrete jungle, below ground urban tree research mitigation study. We want to really thank LEF and LAI for this grant, made this research possible. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Basically, I run the Tropical Landscape and Human Interaction Lab here at the University of Hawaii. It's a multidisciplinary research laboratory that's really dedicated to studying the connection between plants, the outdoor landscape, and the associated human responses and implications on design of the built environment. So today, Miles Ritchie, he's a PhD candidate. He'll be co-presenting with me, and want to acknowledge all the other students that worked on this project over the past 9 years. So looking at the urban forest, we all know that's really an integral part of cities, providing many, many social, environmental, and economic benefits. And with that, trees are extremely important, as they're the longest natural amenity that we put in the landscape, and they improve the urban landscape dramatically. But unfortunately, roots do tend to pose a threat and cause infrastructure damage in many urban situations. So this multi-treatment below ground tree study really incorporates various popular methods to kind of control this below ground root problem. So the root techniques that we used in this study are incorporation of root barriers, root paths, civil cells, and planting pit sizes. As far as we know, this is the first comprehensive study that's really been done, especially here in Hawaii, as well as on the mainland. So the problem really is that there's conflicts between tree roots and urban infrastructure. And not sure if you've ever seen this. One can raise your hands of anyone that's seen anything like this. And this can be quite scary. So this is really predominant in every aspect of urban infrastructure. And we want to try to mitigate this, but also to have trees live in a healthy life. So this can happen, anywhere from Texas, California, Hawaii, New York. This is not limited to just temperate climates or tropical climates. And the majority of this research on urban trees has really been done in temperate climates. And information is really lacking for tropical and subtropical environments such as Hawaii. The one advantage that we're finding out is that here we have, extended growing seasons. And so these limited root studies are likely due to really the high cost and long durations required. So here in Hawaii, again, the advantage is that we have pretty much 362 days of like sunshine. We don't have that thing called winter. So we're able to conduct longer studies in a shorter period of time. And we incorporate roughly 2 to 3 times longer than a temperate climate within research cycles. So with that, the idea was really to create a system that can accommodate tree roots while trying to minimize damage to infrastructure. And that, I think, is every landscape architect, every planner, every city manager's dream. And usually we can look at rerouting sidewalks, we can install root barriers, increase distances from the sidewalk or the road from the trees. There's alternative sub-base materials, the incorporation of tree grants, channeling roots. There's many, many things that we can apply. Each one of these, of course, has pluses and minuses to that. So if we look at it in the big picture, the message of planting trees really hasn't changed in 100 years. Or if we look at it more closely, has it changed or should it changes, and then why? So a typical planting technique is used all over the country with landscape architects, planners, engineers, and there's some basic aspects that we look at. But mostly those aspects are kind of above ground, and really we don't look at what's below ground. And again, below ground is where it gets complicated because of all the infrastructure that goes in for our cities. So we want to try to address this so the roots have a happy place to grow and live, and therefore the plant's happy, and then ultimately society is happy. So with that, recent research has really shown that there are many ways that tree plantings could evolve to try to limit this damage. And again, it's maybe looking at planting pit size, tree species selection, root barriers, root paths, incorporating rubber sidewalks, structural planting, soils, using deep watering techniques, tree wells, and many other techniques. But many municipalities planting specs really employ one predominant technique, and that's root barriers. And this has been shown to have a wide scale of various success rates. So we want to sort of move beyond that and see if there's some other tools that we can incorporate. So there's really a lack of research available on tropical trees and their root systems. And their reaction to various root control methods is, again, seriously limited. So if we look at it in a holistic way, what happens here in the tropics, since we have almost nonstop growing season, if we can help mitigate our situations, that just is a bigger plus to temperate climates around the world. So the Costa Street tree conflicts is really a growing problem, and no pun intended. The average percent of tree budget spent on repairs, at least in 15 North American cities in 1996, was about 25%. And that's a huge amount of cost that's being laid to this. In fact, in the state of California in 2000, there is a whole report done on looking at the costs in relation to trees, specifically for infrastructure damage. And it ran to about almost $71 million. And these root conflicts specifically looked at sidewalks, curbs and gutters, and street pavement. And if you translate the $71 million value in 2023, it would be approximately $122 million spent on looking at costs related to reducing these infrastructure damages by tree roots. So in 2007, the city and county of Honolulu had roughly about 235,000 trees that they managed. And of this, about 142,000 of these trees, about approximately 60%, were actually on city and county roads. And that relates to about a $2.98 in benefits for every $1 spent on street trees. In fact, it turns out to be about $90 per tree annual benefits in this valuation. And it lends to about $12,000, almost $30,000 in annual benefits just for the city and county of Honolulu alone, which is pretty significant. If you extrapolate this out to other municipalities around the country, this is a really phenomenal amount of money that's being spent on this, and as well as benefits. So really the biggest fraction, almost 45% of this budget, goes towards infrastructure repairs of sidewalks, gutters, roads, and sewer pipes. And this is all due to damage by tree roots. And so although these costs are really borne by another department, they really should be considered tree related as they are. And about $2.5 million is spent on infrastructure damage repairs caused by Honolulu street trees alone, just to try to keep things, safe and healthy. For here in Hawaii, especially Honolulu, we house that little place called Waikiki. So we have a lot of tourists. So it's not only for the people who work, live, and play here, but it's all the tourists that come. This can be a significant safety hazard. As you can see by this picture of the bicyclist walking by, there's just major, major improvements that has to be done constantly. So this study was really conceived to address this growing impact of urban trees on infrastructure damage and to see if we can come up with some tools to help mitigate this. So through a group of urban forest advocates comprising of the Hawaii Department of Transportation, the City County of Honolulu Street Tree Division, along with the Aloha Arborist Association and the Hawaii Society of Landscape Architects, as well as myself and Dr. Ed Gilman as an advisor from the University of Florida, we put together this team to see, okay, what can we do to address this? So really for this research study objective, we really wanted to look at the goals of developing root zone strategies for the planting and maintenance of tropical as well as subtropical street trees. And then really to develop a better root zone strategy to assist in reducing infrastructure damage and maintenance. And then to try to apply these strategies to increase the resiliency of newly planted urban trees against natural disasters, and especially to address the effects of climate change. And then to go back again to complete the first long-term tropical tree study for tropical and subtropical environments with results having impacts across the country. And then to really obtain vital planting, growing, and maintenance information for tropical urban trees here in the state. So the project treatments and data collection really consisted of, we wanted to look at minimum planting sizes. And so we chose 3x3, 4x4, and 5x5 pit sizes to see, is this, an advantage or disadvantage when we're planting urban trees? Next, we looked at the installations of root barriers, the use of Silva cells, the use of root paths, along with looking at irrigation practices, the use of planting tree wells, the use of drip line tubing, tree pruning and best management practices, root pruning and planting techniques, and proper tree staking methodologies. For this presentation today, we're just going to keep with the yellow, the top four items that we looked at. So a pilot study was developed to investigate the above as well as below ground biomass impacts of 5 different root barrier treatments that I just explained. And the study was conducted at the University of Hawaii Waimanalo Research Station from 2014 to 2022. Here's a picture of some of the trees and the plots that we have, and I'm going to kind of run that down more specifically. So here in Hawaii, the experiment station is right here in the center in white. It's located in between the ocean, Pacific, and also the Kula Mountains. So the actual little drone shot here is the XR plot, and we had 50 trees, and I'll explain that in a moment. So this is in a huge ag experiment station, and this was our plot right here. So this consisted of 50 trees. It was 25 rainbow shower, Cassia x nealiae, and 25 or Cordia subcordata. These species were selected due to their frequent and use of urban trees in Hawaii. So treatments again were different pit sizes of 3x3, 4x4, and 5x5 feet. Installation of root barriers, Silva cells, and root paths. So each treatment was replicated 10 times. That was 5 for each species, and based on a Latin square design. And this accounted for wind and proximity to the mountain and sidewalk / native soils of the site was our experimental design. One side of each tree planting incorporated a simulated concrete sidewalk, while the opposite side served as sort of a control open ground or more of a parkway situation. The above ground or qualitative assessments included taking information on height, diameter, health, canopy color, and structural quality of the trees during the whole experiment time. So looking at how we sort of did this in methods and materials, first we started with the construction of the research plots. And here we see various students working hard. We first did sidewalk forming. Then we had the tree species delivered, and then we dug all the pits at the field site. And of course, this was lots and lots of fun. Next here, we see the below ground treatments. We see here in the upper right corner, we're starting to install the Silva cell. Next in the upper right corner is again the continuation of the Silva cells on the bottom left. And then at the bottom right, we see a complete installation of the root path, which is right here, coming out of a root barrier. So on tree installation day, we had all of our pits, our 3x3, 4x4, 5x5, and we had our stock delivered from the nursery and found out that they were extremely root bound. So we went in and based on the research of Dr. Rita Hummel at Washington State University, we went in and did very aggressive tree root pruning and root surgery. As an anecdotal note, we approximately did about 90% pruning. And of all those, we only had 3 trees that were severely shocked. But after the first year, they came back stronger than the others. And then we're here to see the planting crew planting everything in. And this was followed by the trees being planted and staked using best management practices. And on the bottom is all the trees planted on the first day. Next, we had the fun of installing the simulated sidewalks. And we went to the city and county. We tried to follow their code as closely as possible. So here we see we're compacting down to the amount required. Then we had things set up. We poured it, leveled it, and screened it out. So each tree received this treatment. And then underneath each of these pads were actually the treatments that we looked at, the root paths, Silva cells, and the tree barriers. So here we did some finishing touches. You know, we are landscape architects and horticulturalists. We want things to look good. So we try to make things even. And then even researchers get their hands dirty. And after doing 50 of these, I think I'm pretty good at doing concrete now. So here's our experimental design again, using the Latin square methodology. Here on your screen to the left is actually a plot, which includes each size of 3x3, 4x4, 5x5, as long as root barriers, the root paths, and the Silva cell installations. Next, we throughout the project, we did above ground tree data collection, and this was recorded every 3 months. And this included height, DBH, diameter, breadth, height measurements, as well as tree growth on several randomly selected branches of each tree. Next, we did qualitative assessments, looking at the health, percent live crown, color canopy, tree vigor, and structural quality of each tree during these 3-month cycles. Next, we got ready for below ground data analysis at the end of the study. And this was preparing the below ground by air spading. Before we could utilize the air spade methodology, we first had to jackhammer the sidewalk pads. Then we had to use this good old fashioned elbow grease to bust them up. Once that was removed, we made our plots measurements to get ready to do the air spading. And before we did that, I was told by the university administration that I had to bring back my grad students in the same condition as when they left campus. So we did some structural pruning to make sure there's no heavy limbs in case the tree fell. So it was a little bit of tree torture, but this was in the name of science and student protection. So then we utilized air spade methodology. We incorporated an air spade 2000 with a 225 CFPM nozzle and a 260 CFM air compressor. You can see that in the background here. So after we had our system laid out, we started to excavate with the air spade. We found out that this took approximately anywhere from 4 to 6 hours per tree. The content of the soil had a lot of clay in it. You can see here, this was at the first strokes of the process. And then here you can see more of the ending aspect of it. And I'll give you a little bit more of a taste of that in a second. So once we had our sections excavated, we utilized what was called the quadrat pit system. And each of these quadrats were cut out on each side of the tree through the air spade. And then we had to use a shop vac to vacuum all the soil out and then physically remove all the boulders after that. So again, this took approximately 4 to 6 hours per tree and sometimes longer. So this was definitely a team effort. And here's an example. So we first had to make squares of each block. And then after this, we could actually start to bust it out with a sledgehammer. Next, we started the air spading. So again, there was a high clay content in the soil, which took a long time. The great thing about air spading is that it moves a lot of soil without damaging the major roots. Of course, the smaller root hairs are vaporized, but we were looking at mainly at root damaging potential roots. And then this shows the air spading of the actual quadrat. And now this is being exposed to one of the root areas. So after this was all done, then we were able to look at the below ground biomass data, and we could start this collecting utilizing our air spade methodologies that I just showed you. And these quadrats were 1 by 2 foot with 18-inch intervals, and these were centered 3 feet from each tree trunk in the study. The excavation directly under each concrete pad was conducted, as I explained, as well as 180 degrees from that concrete pad on the control side. So basically, we did these the quadrat excavation underneath the treatment, as well as on the other side of the control area or the open field. So the treatment pits were excavated to a depth of 24 inches. And this examined the root impacts above, below, and around each treatment, as we can see in the diagram here. All the quote unquote concrete damaging roots were estimated at 15 millimeters and above. And this in the quadrat area to the depth of 15 inches were measured and recorded. So the below ground data collection, again, utilizes quadrat methodology. And a 2 by 1 foot quadrat for collecting the data was utilized using the strings that were fixed on this PVC platform every 4 inches. And then at every point of the intersection of the string, data on root amount, the diameter, and the depth was collected for a total of 28 points per quadrat per tree in the study. So with that, we have our data collection. I'm going to turn this over to Miles, and he'll talk about this for a bit.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Kaufman. Hi, everyone. Okay, so jumping right into it, this is the above ground biomass data collection sheet that we used. You'll notice the 8 metrics that we collected data for every 3 to 6 months. The first 4 being DBH, height, live crown ratio, and crown spread being the physical metrics we measured. And then the more subjective ones being health, canopy color, tree vigor, and structural quality. It's really important to note that in order to ensure the best standardized data collection as possible for these more subjective metrics, the same researcher was the one collecting the data each time. So that helped with it as well. And a lot of comparisons were taking place also between the same months. as well to factor in, leaf loss just due to normal cycles. In the top left corner, you can actually see the 5-point Likert scale we used, with 1 being the healthiest or best quality that we observed and 5 being the worst. Now, let's see if it works. If not, Dr. K, I might just need you to click ahead.
Yep.
Well, let's go with that. I'll say next slide. Okay, great. So then what we essentially had was the full analysis for this, both the above and below ground biomass data, was looking at a comparison between the 5 treatments. So the Silva cell, the root path, and the 3x3, 4x4, and 5x5 root barrier. All of this, you can actually click if you want. All of this was done using the software RStudio, so coded in that to try and find statistical significance, and that was achieved using the one-way ANOVA statistical analysis with an alpha value or p-value of 0.05, which essentially means our confidence interval was 95%. Next slide, please. And a couple more points. Essentially, what happened was this is really important to note. As Dr. K mentioned, there was some severe root pruning that took place initially. Whether this is because of that or not, or some other factors, we're not sure. But relatively early on in the study, so 2017, the rainbow shower, which was E1 on that Latin square design, died. And it's really unfortunate because it happened to be one of the Silva cells, but that's just how it was. Now, why this is problematic is because the Latin square design and the statistical analysis we're using on it requires that each tree in that grid has a value in order for the calculations to be made. So how do we get around this? We use something called the MDA package in R to estimate that value. And it's useful because that's its entire purpose, is to take what's already known for a specific treatment with the values that have been produced and generate that number with a relative or pretty close accuracy. And to test that, just so we weren't using kind of a black box style, because we did have the full 5x5 grid for the COs, I pulled out the Z1 location, so it went A to E and then W down to Z, and pulled that one out, ran the same package to see what the values produced were. And you can actually see in the bottom there, the true value that we actually measured out in the field, that was pulled, and then what the MDA package produced for each of these different metrics. And you can see how accurate it was. So that gave us a lot of confidence for the values that were produced for the E1 rainbow shower that died during the study. Next slide, please. So essentially what we're looking at here is, this is some of the bread and butter of what we found. So for the above ground biomass, this is looking at the rainbow shower side of things. For the Silva cell treatments, and keep in mind this is for the first half of the study, the Silva cell treatment did outperform the 3x3 and 5x5 root barrier treatments for canopy color. Now they did catch up throughout the study, and we're looking into why that may have taken place. But that was for the rainbow shower initially for the Silva cell. Additionally, for the rainbow showers, we did see statistically significant reduced values for height, DBH, and canopy color throughout the entire study. And that's broken down into the 5x5 root barrier producing reduced values, statistically significant reduced values for height compared to all other treatments, as well as lower DBH values for the same 5x5 root barrier compared to the 3x3 root path, as well as the 3x3 and 4x4 root barrier. Remember, this is just for the rainbow shower species. Shifting over to the COs, interestingly enough, there was no statistical significance in terms of the above ground biomass data for the metrics we collected, which you can begin to infer that treatment then has little effect on above ground biomass for the COs, but not the rainbow showers. Shifting over to the below ground biomass, which I know a lot of you are interested in, we didn't find any statistical significance between the treatments. This is interesting because, as you'll see, we in the pictures we'll demonstrate in a second, outside of the transect area, there was clearly a lot going on. And the methodology is sound, it's in the literature, it makes sense, but having gone outside of it, we really started to see that this doesn't explain the whole picture of what's really going on. So within the transect area, no statistical significance. Outside of it, there could be. So That's something to really note, that there's the statistical side in the transect, and then outside of it with the more anecdotal pictures, observations that we had. And using these observations, we did see that the Silva cell clearly had the most centralized root system, root mass system compared to all of the other treatments. Next slide, please. And here's some images of that. So you can see the rainbow shower and Silva cell here, with the majority of the large roots actually doing what they're intended to do with the Silva cell, going into the pit. You can see that there was one coming over the top on both sides. We'll get to that a little bit later as to why that most likely occurred. But for the most part, it's doing a really good job. But with that, 2 by 1 foot transect, it might not necessarily capture everything that's going on. So that's something we'll get into later, as well as potential future research improvements for methodologies for others. And this is just the same thing, Silva cell with the co-species now, generally doing a pretty good job. But as again, you'll see that the roots coming up over top once again occurred. So we'll get into that. Next slide, please. Okay, for those of you who are visual learners and like graphs and charts and everything of that nature, I'll go over this real fast, but essentially the turquoise color is the control. So the side without any actual root barrier treatment and without a concrete pad. Well, the orange is the concrete pad in the treatment we're looking at. Easy way to think about this is the left side is the better treatment, the right side is the worst, because the orange bar you want to be reduced, because those are those concrete damaging roots, the 15 millimeters or greater in size. So for the co's, you can clearly see that the Silva cell did far better than any of the other treatments. One less statistically significant, we can still see that there's a lot going on here. Once again, compared to the root barrier 5 by 5. So the 5 by 5 is being really interesting in that, depending on the species and the metrics being looked at above ground, below ground, there's some negatives that we're finding, and we're also looking at that quite a bit right now. Shifting down to the rainbow shower species, you can see quite a difference actually in terms of the between the control and the treatments for the number of concrete damaging roots, specifically that they've been reduced. So, and if you do a quick analysis looking at the top treatments and the bottom treatments, so for the co's and the rainbow showers, you can see that they're all misplaced. So it's not just like they were Silva cell, 4 by 4 root barrier 3 by 3. For both of them, they're all over the place, which is starting to indicate that there might be a species, a pretty important species factor in this kind of research, and in terms of the impacts and effects of root barrier treatments on different trees. And so you can definitely see different between species, and maybe a morphological difference in terms of the rainbow showers being a larger tree and having different root system style compared to the co's. Maybe that's why there's some beneficial impacts being seen. Next slide, please. And this is just bringing them all together. So we mentioned that there were 10 replications for each treatment, 5 and 5. That's bringing them together for both the co and the rainbow shower in this graph. And this is what it looks like across the whole treatment, across the whole survey. So interestingly enough, the root barrier 4 by 4 had the fewest number of concrete damaging roots across the study, followed closely by the Silva cell. And if you remember in that last slide, for the rainbow showers, the Silva cell actually had a medium amount of damaging roots. Once again, we'll get into that with the potential flooding issue that happened at the site shortly after installation. But still, the 4 by 4 root barrier and Silva cell collectively almost fared, identical. It's great. So pretty close. Now, if you're looking at it more broadly, and you're looking at treatment versus control, this is what we see, is that regardless of which treatment you're using, there were 597 concrete damaging roots collectively across these treatments, versus, for the treatment side, and then almost 700 for the control side. So what this means is by putting some type of treatment in, you're looking at just under 15% fewer damaging roots. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this all mean then? The main takeaways of this, that the root path definitely did not perform as well as the Silva cell, but it was still better than the control side of it, which had far more concrete damaging roots. So it did have some impact, beneficial impact. And root barriers as a whole, 3 by 3, 4 by 4, 5 by 5, when you look at the entire root structure and the growth patterns, it didn't perform that great. And the reason being is that the roots went above, below, through the barriers to ultimately reach the surface. And we'll see that in the next slide, actually, which is really powerful. We saw this with a couple trees. Next slide, please. Right here. So the one on the left is actually the root path. So you see the root barrier around the tree, and then the path itself, which is supposed to guide the roots. The root just went right through the root barrier used for this. And same with the one on the right. It was pretty interesting to excavate these and see this happening, because this is pretty strong plastic. But yep, the tree roots are going straight through, above, below, around. So something interesting to note that was also found frequently in the literature. And for some of the trees, the B row, initially we did a preliminary excavation to see what was going on. And you can start to see with a more 360 excavation versus just the transect and the control excavations, there's a lot more going on than outside that transect zone. So you can see the typical root barriers on the top left and right, as well as the root path and the Silva cell. And just from these images, you can start to see, anecdotally and just observationally, that there might be some that are more advantageous and effective than others. Next
so you can
slide,
see,
please.
yeah, so you can see here, as Miles was saying, that the root path there was a lot of roots that were following that, but there was some, a lot outside. And then again, this was a great picture that showed a general consensus that the Silva cell did contain things. As Miles suggested earlier, right after, I think it was the third year, we had a flood on half of the plot. And so some of the root paths and trees and Silva cells all sunk a little bit. And, we were thought, okay, maybe we should replant everything. But then if you look at it in the real world, not always is insulation perfect. And sometimes trees are planted lower, or the root barriers are not planted correctly. So we wanted to leave this in as a real world example. And again, we saw this over and over again of even the ones that weren't affected by the flood, roots just kind of crawled over it on both species. So again, the effect of the root barriers on the mean root depth is really kind of inconclusive statistically. And there was really no two-dimensional barrier class or brand consistently that outperformed the others. And then the soil environment definitely has an effect, as well as the barrier design and the tree species, to really interact with the influence and the outcome of the root barrier experiments that we found out. And then it's really kind of highly variable in nature of the number of root quantifications. And this really suggests that this might be a parameter is more highly influenced by species, other than barrier type or soil type, than the presence or absence of the barrier.
So the main takeaway so the main takeaway I would really have from this slide, which is linking up our research with what's been put in the literature already, is location, species, and barrier type are three major impacts of how the results will transpire. They all have major effects on the size of the roots, the quantity of the roots, the depth of the roots. So trying to isolate one is relatively tricky in a study like this. So for anybody else who's looking to doing research like this, try to factor all of that in as well as best as you can. But yes, there's those three major factors.
So again, looking at root diameter and depth, roots grow under the barrier and then upwards on the surface. The trunk diameter was really not impacted by the root barrier treatments as well.
But interestingly enough, if we go back to the, just thinking back to the above ground biomass that I mentioned for the rainbow shower trees, that we did see that there was a statistically significant reduced DBH value, not based on treatments, but based on potential pit size, because we saw that there was a statistical significance between the 5x5 root barrier and the 4x4 root barrier. So that's within treatments, statistical significance indicating pit size might actually be a much greater factor than the treatment itself.
And again, the Silva cell treatment displayed the most promise over all the three treatments for lessening the potential of damaging roots impacts that we found on the site. And the root path treatments showed better root control than no below ground treatment at all, as can be seen here. Any other comments, Miles?
Nope, it's all good.
And then looking at the smaller planting pit size, 3x3 and 4x4, is it really kind of indicated a greater tree vigor than the larger pit size. And this was one thing that the DOT was really looking at, because if you're, spending time on the 3x3, 4x4, it's much less digging that than a big 5x5 pit. A larger planting pit size, 5x5, indicated a lower DBH, as Miles indicated, and root barriers were pretty much ineffective in containing roots in all the pit sizes and all the treatments. Any additions, Miles?
Yeah, it's just essentially that so throughout all this, we've seen that there are some impacts, but in terms of a silver bullet to deal with this tree root infrastructure issue, there's no silver bullet at this point. It's a 15% reduction by using some kind of a treatment, depending on which species and the treatment used. Okay, but yes, there wasn't this massively significant reduction that one might have hypothesized.
So, we looked at, what are always possible factors affecting the study and how can we improve it next time? And again, we had a partially flooded site that caused ground subsidence, and this is similar to incorrect planting methods that we discussed earlier. The transect method that we selected did not provide a really comprehensive depiction of damaged roots, as indicated by Miles, that were outside this area. And again, we took this because we only had so much time and money allotted for our grants, given that it took, anywhere from 4 to 6 hours per tree. We just simply ran out of time and money. So the research indicated that this transect method is a really good viable way of looking at below ground data. And then again, our small sample size for each treatment, we need to have more replications. We feel really excited that we were able to do this pilot study because again, this was the first study that's really incorporated all these different methodologies in one study. And so now, I think we have a better idea of how this could be done on a greater scale to gain more information. But I think that we have, a pretty good indication of the different treatments that we found. So we want to thank all the research partners that participated in this study, because there was many, and LAI and LEF were one of the dominant ones. And we really appreciate your time, and any questions that you have, we'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, there are 2 questions that have been put into the chat. The first may have been covered, but I would like you to address it anyway. And it appears the root barrier was placed between the planting pits and the silva cells. Is that true? And how did the roots exit the tree pit and get into the silva cell soil?
Great question. You want to address that first, Miles, and I'll jump in?
Yeah, if we could go back to some of the silva cell images, you'll be able to see that more clearly. But yes, essentially the same thing. There was the root barrier, big initial exit point that then fed into the silva cell pits. So yes, there was that initial area there, trying to contain them towards this opening that would then feed into the silva cell itself. Does that answer your question? So essentially they exited into the silva cell through that exit.
Right, so this was based on manufacturer recommendations.
Correct.
Okay. And the second one, I'm sure, is probably top of mind for every developer is, did you do a cost benefit analysis? Especially for the private developers that is really looking at what is the best result, what is the greatest benefit for everyone, and lastly, what is the sweet spot with the best treatment?
Yeah, obviously what the data indicates is the best sweet spot is utilizing the silva cell methodology units. As far as a cost benefit analysis, we haven't really gone to that point, basically because it varies so much depending on, this is going to be applied here in Hawaii or across the country. And then just based on the initial damages that's being caused by tree roots across the country, the anecdotal cost benefit analysis is much greater by installing these things and preventing this as opposed to, not. The thing is that, this is for new installations. What we really need to address is what do we do with existing trees that are in these environments? But we haven't specifically crunched the numbers yet. But anecdotally, yeah, it's a great benefit versus a cost to install these either root paths, Silva cells into the ground.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. I'll just finish up real quick here. Essentially, what we are looking at that right now, but in terms of trying to get the current cost estimates, the frequency of occurrences, how much the infrastructure damage is currently causing, we're trying to get that from the respective agencies right now. But there is new literature coming out that is talking about, well, how much do you actually save by ensuring a long-term survival of a street tree versus constantly, chopping it down, redoing the concrete, whatever, sidewalk, and then replanting again. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of Australia. So I think we're going to start to look at that and see how it can be brought over to a more Hawaii-specific focus to start to answer questions such as that, which are really useful and necessary.
Okay, and then in your quadrant study, question is, did any of the concrete pads uplift?
Yeah, actually, we initially had some markers there, and we didn't really see any uplifts in any of our pads.
And then about the water, wastewater pipes below ground, I'm going to assume you really did not have that issue.
No.
Were you hand watering the trees, or what were some of the efforts that you used to actually keep the tree alive in this study session versus in an urban setting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the first probably like 3 months, we hand watered with the tree wells. And then after that, we switched to drip line methodology for the first growing season. And then we actually had a drought the second growing season. So we kept a drip on. And then after that, all irrigation was cut off.
Okay. There's someone who's asking you to continue with the grant. Could you continue this research to look at root pruning responses and strategies, and what's up for these trees next?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were actually just talking about that. Yeah, if we received, funding, we could actually do further excavation to do that 360 view to see what's happening outside that quadrat system. Currently, right now, the trees are still there. They're kind of fallow, and they're kind of on the chopping block within the next year or so when someone needs that plot. But yeah, it would be possible if we had the funding to continue more investigation on these trees.
So with the study that you have, I know you looked at the 2 species, and University of Florida was a part of your initial study in helping with the collaboration. Is it possible for another state or university to replicate the study with their specific trees? Have you put together any type of performa or anything that others could be using?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question. So we're just finishing up our final report right now. And then once that's published, it gives all the methods and methodologies and materials of what we did. And that's the whole idea of research, to not only try to answer those questions, but then for others to take that and implement it. So yeah, that's what's really kind of exciting. So yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah, that's definitely is something we've been talking about as well, especially due to the lack of statistical significance for the below ground side of things. How could this study be replicated and improved to, maybe learn from what we found? And so a methodological paper will be coming out that shows not only how we did what we did, but then because of the results, what we think or, what we suggest should be done by others to try and improve on that. So they can either replicate it or just improve upon the method that we're starting to develop.
I'll give a couple of minutes for others to type in questions, but I do have a lot of questions. Another is, because of the large number of trees in urban environments and the issues that we see, are there any techniques that could be used now for those areas, short of constant repair, that may work?
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to a colleague the other day, and we're actually working on another grant to look at that. but a lot of it, is trying to deep water, or it's the sidewalk repair, or actually lifting the sidewalk up using structural soils. They're coming out with other methodologies of what do you do when you have this existing problem. And fortunately, it's time consuming and costly. And a lot of times it depends on the site specific. There's no like one silver bullet answer of like, oh, okay, if you have a sidewalk being busted up or a roadway, this is what you do. Not to be evasive, but it's really site specific, species specific, and then looking at what's the best way to mitigate that at that time. So it's a good question, and we're trying to answer that.
So are there any questions that you feel the audience hasn't asked that you would like to comment on?
Again, we're really excited that we were able to put together this pilot study. It was very innovative in looking at different treatments. Usually you look at one treatment, and so we wanted to combine things to make it more of a real world application. And again, we only had so much time and so much money with this pilot study. And now we kind of know how we could have made it better and have more statistical information. But I think anecdotally, I think this really shows that some of these techniques work, some of these techniques don't really work, but we really need to start looking at how we plant trees below ground so we get all those amazing environmental and economic and social benefits above ground.
That's great. Okay, with that, I will conclude this webinar. The QR code again has been brought back onto the screen. So if you wanted to scan that and fill out the survey, that would be great. And there was a question, and I think many of you who've attended these webinars are familiar with it. This session is recorded and it will be posted on the LAI YouTube site. So you will have that information. And as with all of our other LEF grant recipients, once the paper is published or some information, we will be providing links to the journals so that you can have more in-depth research or information about some of these studies. So with that, I think we're 8 minutes early. We'll give you back the time and want to thank all of you for attending today.
Great. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Thanks, everyone.